Otto Lasky at the Interdevelopmental Institute. And tonight I'd like to speak a little bit for 10 or so minutes about the development of adults' thinking. Thinking in contrast to social emotional development, which has to do with meaning making, whereas thinking has to do with how you see the world conceptually, how you construct it, and how the world shows up for you. And I will use an example I've often taught in my courses, which has to do with 3 managers who are part of a firm called Acme, who has been product-centered so far, but now has merged with a service business. And these managers, who are at different levels of cognitive development, have very different views of what the situation is they are in. And that's what I want to demonstrate. And you can imagine that if these 3 managers were part of a team, how they would differ in their view of what decisions have to be made, that will become very clear. And I will simply call these managers A, B, and C, where A is the least developed and C is the most cognitively developed manager. So you can either look at them as C being, the end result of a development in one and the same person starting from A, or they are just different people. It doesn't really matter. So here is what A is saying about the situation. He's saying when we bought Acme's service business, it was clear that if we didn't build efficiency into the combined network, we would fail. Efficiency means reduced overall costs, more revenue from our customer base, and less work overlap. Now we can price our products more competitively, knowing we can continue to build our revenue stream through service contracts. And providing that services will keep us close to our customers for equipment lifecycle planning and utilization analysis, if we can keep our eyes open and focus on managing costs and delivering quality, the results will be there. So this is Manager A. Before commenting on this kind of thinking, which is good logical thinking, I will go to Manager B, who speaks about the same situation, but very differently. He says, when we bought Acme's service business, it was clear that one of the immediate advantages would be in building a more efficient network. By integrating product and service sales, we become a more complete operation, and customers will see us in a new light. However, we also become more vulnerable to a lack of integration until we can define that new business model and manage retraining and redirecting our sales force. Even then, perhaps, customers may feel we are not as focused on our huge new service operation as was Acme, which was product-centered. And engineering is committed to reducing maintenance and manufacturing, to driving up quality, and so forth and so forth. Would customers see that as a dilution of our commitment to our own products? We are juggling many more things than before and risk overextending ourselves. That's Manager B. So, are they thinking logically? Are they thinking dialectically, in a certain sense? You cannot tell that from the content. You have to look at the structure of their thinking, and by that I mean in the sense of the dialectical thought form framework, or DTF, that we teach here. You have to look at and listen to and understand the thought form structure of their speech. Now, if we, as we do here, distinguish between 4 moments of dialectic, also called 4 classes of thought forms, then it seems to me that manager A is entirely only in one of them, in one of the classes, namely context, in that he or she sees only static configurations. He doesn't go into the history, he doesn't go into the future. He just says, we now have reduced overall costs, we have more revenue from our customer base and less work overlap. He doesn't think in terms of process or emerging change, and he doesn't think in terms of relationship in the sense of seeing intrinsic links between different parts of the company and customers, the company and markets. And that is the reason why we can say that manager B is more developed cognitively, because he has begun to include customers in his thinking. What will customers think of our merger? Are we as committed to our products as we were? And how they see us will be highly important for what we should do in this new situation. So manager B says, for instance, customers will see us in a new light. However, we also become more vulnerable to a lack of integration until we can define that new business model and manage retraining and redirecting of our sales force. So he begins to think in terms of relationship. And he goes further and says, even then, even if we do that, perhaps customers will feel we are not as focused on our huge new service operation as was Acme, the old firm. So I would say that customer, or rather manager B, is cognitively in a different phase of development, more highly developed, because he can think in terms of relationships. And implicitly, he is also thinking in terms of process, emerging change. How will customers see us? So there you have an example of 2 individuals who see the same situation very differently because they are in different phases of cognitive development, from logical to dialectical thinking. That's what DTF helps us assess and give feedback on and consult on the basis of. Now let's go to manager C, which, as I said, is the most developed. He says, once we decided to buy Acme's service business, we knew that there were a lot of ramifications to consider that could only incompletely be foreseen right away. We knew that in many ways we had considerably complicated not only our in-house way of working, but also the market environment in which we would have to function. While on the one hand, we were clearly striving to become a more complete operation, we had previously been on safer ground since our business model had been thoroughly tested and validated, and we had a reasonably clear view of who our customers were and what they expected of us. But once we integrated Acme's service business, we had to rethink almost everything we had learned to take more and more, had learned to take for granted. There were questions of, and then he goes into a list of the questions that arose for him and are arising for him. And at the end, he says we now had to coordinate a larger number of subsystems, and these subsystems tended to transform in a way that was not initially foreseen or even foreseeable. As a result, we felt we would lose out if we did not succeed in developing multiple perspectives on almost every aspect of our organization. Now, here you have a fine example. Now, let's first talk about in what way manager C goes beyond manager B. From the content I've read you, if we analyze it even superficially, we can see that manager B has moved into thinking in terms of emerging change, as well as relationship thought forms in the dialectical sense of intrinsic relationships, and also of common ground, which means that he can see different entities to be related on account of their difference, so that he can think difference and identity or sameness together. So he says, for instance, we are moving away from a validated business model, and now we have to rethink almost everything that we had begun to take for granted. That's a transformational view of the situation, meaning that we have to not only look at static context of what it was like and is like, but we have to consider all the changes that occur as we have merged with a service business, and not only have to take the customers and their relationship to us into account, but we also have to reposition ourselves in the larger environment of the markets we are in. And so essentially, our task has become very, very much more difficult, and we as a company have become much more and more fragile. So that the more complex a company or something is, the more fragile it is. Manager C understands that. Now, let's for a moment look at what would happen if these three people would come together in a team. They were maybe part of an executive team that has to make decisions about strategy in the coming 5 years. You can just immediately imagine how they would either clash or disagree or not find consensus. And how could you help them as a consultant or a team coach or team mentor? What would you do? Well, if you did not understand the differences in cognitive level of thinking of these three executives, you could do very little. You could suggest all kinds of behavioral changes, like get to know each other better and think this through again and all these niceties. But essentially, you couldn't really do much. The psychological interventions wouldn't work because this is not about a relationship between people primarily. It is about being able to see a task and the structure of the task at hand more clearly. It's predominantly a cognitive issue. So that's what we can do with CDF once we have learned it, that we can make an analysis of what are members of this team thinking, why are they differing, how can we intervene in such a way that they can see common ground. And this may take individual coaching of each of them before such a consensus and collaborative intelligence can emerge. So today I've given you a little inkling of what knowing about the dialectical thought form system that we teach here at IDM is good for, how it goes beyond behavioral interventions that 99% of people are now undertaking, without having any notion of developmental differences either between individuals and teams. And I hope you will find this interesting, and I invite you to go to our website, interdevelopmentals.org, where you can look at upcoming teleseminars, workshops, courses, and feel free to get back to me and write to me at otto@interdevelopmentals.org. I'll be glad to give you more details and even mentor you in your own issues as part of a team that you may be in. Thank you very much for listening to me, and have a good evening.